On February 8, 1942, 95,000 German soldiers awoke to discover they were completely encircled in the frozen woodlands around Demyansk. What unfolded over the following weeks would seal the fate of an entire army at Stalingrad 9 months later. This is the story of how victory became the deadliest teacher in military history. The Demyansk pocket endured thanks to an unprecedented airlift operation. The Luftwaffe flew more than 32,000 cargo sorties, delivered 24,000 tons of supplies, ferried in 15,000 replacement troops, and evacuated 22,000 wounded. That survival appeared to prove that air power could rescue encircled armies. But the proof was an illusion. The conditions that kept Demyansk alive were singular, unrepeatable, and fatally misread. When Nazi leadership applied those same lessons to Stalingrad, they guaranteed one of the most catastrophic military defeats in recorded history. As German forces ground to a halt, before Moscow in December 1941, the Soviets readied their counterattack along a 1,000-mile front. The counteroffensive launched on January 7, 1942. General Pavel Kurochkin commanded the Soviet Northwest Front. His forces struck south of Lake Ilmen that morning, 400,000 troops driving toward Staraya Russa and Demyansk. Temperatures had plunged to 30 below zero. The earth was frozen solid, but the Red Army was advancing. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. This was no localized operation. The Soviet winter campaign stretched from December 1941 to May 1942, 5 unbroken months of continuous offensive action. Stalin was convinced the moment had arrived for a decisive shift in the war. He told his commanders, "Our task is to deny the Germans any respite, to drive them relentlessly westward, to compel them to exhaust their reserves before spring, and thereby ensure the total destruction of Hitler's forces in 1942. The Toropets-Kulm offensive began on January 9th, forming the southern pincer. The northern pincer had launched 2 days prior. The Soviets were attacking everywhere simultaneously. The Moscow Strategic Offensive, the Lyuban Offensive, the Rzhev-Vyazma operation, multiple concurrent operations spanning the entire front. Each fed momentum into the others. Each opened new avenues for exploitation. German intelligence officers studied their maps with mounting dread. The Wehrmacht had driven deep into Soviet territory during the summer and autumn of 1941. Now, those deep thrusts created exposed salients, vulnerable flanks, and supply lines stretched taut across hostile ground. The German army was dangerously overextended. Winter had arrived early and savage. The terrain around Demyansk offered no relief. A Soviet battery commander named Vladimir Flankin later described the region. "The Northwest is difficult in its own way. True, it rarely sees extreme cold or unbearable heat. The climate is mild and damp, but forests and marshes are everywhere. The humidity never lets up. Step off the path and you sink waist-deep in swamp. Roads barely exist." The frozen earth was hard as concrete, yet snowdrifts smothered every road. Forests funneled movement into predictable corridors. Everything took longer. Everything demanded more effort. The cold drained energy from every man, turning routine tasks into ordeals. The bulge in the German lines around Demyansk looked like a golden opportunity on Soviet maps and a death trap waiting to spring shut. 2 German corps occupied this salient. The 2nd Corps under General Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt and the 10th Corps under General Christian Hansen had pushed eastward during the autumn offensive. The salient jutted into Soviet territory like a clenched fist. Lake Ilmen formed a natural barrier to the north, a frozen sheet of ice in winter, impassable wetlands the rest of the year. The German salient stretched beyond the lake's eastern shore, creating a dangerously exposed shape that invited encirclement. Trapped within the pocket were 6 divisions. The 12th Infantry Division from Mecklenburg and the 32nd Infantry Division from Pomerania held positions east and south of Demyansk. The battered 123rd Infantry Division fought along the southwestern perimeter. The 30th Infantry Division from Schleswig-Holstein and the 291st Infantry Division from Hanover defended north of the town. And occupying the most exposed positions of all was the SS Division Totenkopf under Theodor Eicke. Eicke was no ordinary commander. Before the war, he had served as inspector of concentration camps. He had personally executed SS Chief Ernst Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. His division had been raised from concentration camp guards, men who had learned cruelty as a vocation. The Totenkopf had already earned a savage reputation during the 1940 French campaign, where they perpetrated the Le Paradis massacre, executing nearly 100 British prisoners of war. Now, they would earn a very different kind of distinction as the most tenacious defenders inside the pocket. The pocket encompassed 3,000 square kilometers. The perimeter requiring defense stretched 186 miles. The distance across it measured 30 to 45 miles. Soviet planners recognized the opportunity instantly. Strike north of the salient, strike south of the salient. The two thrusts would converge behind the German rear. The geometry was straightforward. The prize justified the cost. 2 complete German corps cut off and annihilated. On February 8, 1942, the ring snapped shut at the village of Zaluchi. The Soviet 1st Shock Army and 11th Army, supported by the 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps, completed the encirclement. 2 entire German corps were now trapped. 90,000 regular troops and roughly 10,000 auxiliaries, including labor service units, police detachments, and construction workers. Third Reich leadership forbade the use of the word pocket to describe it. Nazi propaganda favored terms like Fortress Demyansk or Stronghold in the East. On February 22nd, Hitler designated it a Festung, a fortress to be held against all resistance. This was not a suggestion. This was a direct order. Every meter of conquered ground had to be defended. The Führer believed that flexible defense was cowardice, that any withdrawal would become a rout, and that standing firm was the only acceptable course. The soldiers of 2nd Army Corps had their own name for their prison. They called it the County, since their commander von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt held the rank of a genuine count. Gallows humor in a frozen hell. German commanders immediately began drawing up breakout plans. Established military doctrine left no ambiguity. When encircled, you punch out immediately. Before the enemy ring solidifies, before supplies dwindle to nothing, you mass your forces, identify the weakest point in the enemy cordon, concentrate everything against it, and smash through. Accept heavy losses, but preserve the army. The orders from higher command said otherwise. Hold your positions, defend the pocket, a relief force will be organized. The Luftwaffe will supply you by air until it arrives. Just hold on, help is coming. What the Luftwaffe attempted at Demyansk had never been tried on this scale. General Fritz Morzig, commanding air transport operations, received urgent orders. He set up his headquarters at Pleskow Sud near Pskov, a 1,200-meter airstrip outfitted with hangars and repair facilities linked directly to the main rail line. His staff was skeletal, himself, 5 officers, and 3 enlisted men. Captain Metter ran operations and intelligence. Captain Trautwein served as technical officer, Lieutenant. Langanger handled personnel. Lieutenant Oberlander managed communications. Lieutenant Berndt completed the team. Morzig assembled 15 groups of transport aircraft. Junkers Ju-52 trimotors formed the backbone. These were the workhorses of German military aviation. Dependable, rugged, slow. Each plane could carry roughly 2 tons of cargo or 20 fully equipped soldiers. The payload was modest. The number of available aircraft was limited, but the need was absolute. The pocket contained 2 usable airfields, Demyansk itself and Pesky to the south-southeast, a strip approximately 600 meters long and 30 meters wide, carved from hard-packed snow on level ground. Pesky could handle only 3 to 6 aircraft at once. A marked drop zone on open terrain allowed supplies to be parachuted when landings were impossible. The daily requirement was 300 tons, the bare minimum to sustain 95,000 men. Each Ju-52 carried 2 tons. The arithmetic was unforgiving. At 2 sorties per day per aircraft, Morzig needed at least 75 transports flying constantly, without a single loss. He would never have anything approaching that margin. But there was no alternative. If the airlift collapsed, the pocket died. The transports flew in formations of 20 to 40 aircraft, operating between 1,800 and 2,400 meters altitude. Soviet fighters challenged them on every approach. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s flew escort, tangling with Soviet interceptors above the pocket. Sometimes the escorts held, sometimes Soviet fighters broke through. A Ju-52 caught by a fighter stood no chance, no meaningful defensive armament, no speed to outrun anything, no agility to dodge. When fighters penetrated the screen, transports burned. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. They fired on every aircraft that came near. Transports were large, slow, unmissable targets. Losses climbed steadily. Each downed aircraft meant lost cargo, dead crews, and diminished capacity for future missions. But from mid-February onward, the weather improved significantly. And critically, Soviet air forces in the sector remained comparatively quiet, still recovering from the catastrophes of 1941. The Red Air Force had been gutted during the initial German onslaught. By early 1942, Soviet aviation was rebuilding, but it was not yet the formidable instrument it would become later in the war. The airlift succeeded because everything aligned. A manageable pocket, adequate airfields, feeble Soviet air opposition, short distances to German bases, enough aircraft scraped together from across the front. Soviet exhaustion from their own grinding winter campaign. When even one of those variables shifted, the entire equation would shatter. The airlift kept the Demyansk garrison alive, but alive inside a frozen purgatory of constant combat and deprivation. Winter in northwestern Russia shows no mercy. Temperatures plunged to 40, below zero. The cold was a physical force. It bore through every layer of clothing. It froze exposed skin within minutes. Sentries pulled watch in 2-hour shifts. Any longer and frostbite was inevitable. Men swaddled their faces in scarves, leaving only their eyes uncovered. Breath turned to ice mid-air. Frost caked eyebrows and beards. The cold bled strength from muscles, made every step heavier, made every chore take twice as long. Defensive positions were gouged from frozen ground, trenches hacked out of earth as hard as stone, dugouts roofed with timber and packed snow. The positions blocked wind and stopped small arms fire. But they were never warm. Men clustered around feeble fires, burning whatever they could scavenge. Wood, furniture ripped from deserted buildings, anything combustible. The fires offered scant warmth, but they also betrayed positions. Soviet mortars zeroed in on every wisp of smoke. Food was reduced to survival rations, compressed blocks, hardtack, dried meat. Nothing fresh, nothing hot unless the men could heat it themselves. Water meant melting snow over flame. Every meal was identical, every day indistinguishable from the last. The monotony became its own punishment. Men dreamed of real food. Fresh bread, hot soup, and the dreams only sharpened the misery of waking. Soviet attacks came without pause. The Northwest Front was determined to crush the pocket before relief could arrive. 5 Soviet armies, totaling 18 infantry divisions and 3 brigades, were pinned down for 4 months in wave after wave of assaults. Probing attacks tested the perimeter. Company-strength raids struck strong points. Battalion-sized assaults hammered at the lines. Artillery barrages preceded every charge. Shells tore through the air. The frozen ground erupted in geysers of earth and ice. Shrapnel screamed in every direction. Men flattened themselves against trench floors, prayed the next round would land anywhere else. When the shelling lifted, Soviet infantry surged forward. German machine guns opened up. The killing cycle began again. The SS Totenkopf Division shouldered the heaviest fighting. Eicke's troops held some of the most dangerously exposed positions in the pocket. They fought with a fury born of ideology and desperation. One SS captain, named Urban Muldres, assembled a battle group of roughly 120 soldiers and held the strategic town of Byakhovo against repeated Soviet attempts to seize it. During these engagements, Muldres personally knocked out several enemy tanks from his Stug 3 assault gun. He was awarded the Iron Cross for his actions. The division was ground to a skeleton. By March 1942, the Totenkopf had suffered nearly 13,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. 11 of its members received the Knight's Cross for valor. But decorations could not resurrect the dead. The division was so depleted it had to be redesignated Kampfgruppe Eike, a battle group rather than a division. The standard paper strength of a first-class infantry division was 17,000 men. The combined strength of all 6 divisions inside the pocket had dwindled to just 14,000. They were 6 divisions on paper, 1 understrength division in reality. By August 1942, when the remnants were finally extracted, Totenkopf divisional strength stood at barely 2,700 men. 80% of the original formation had been killed, wounded, or listed as missing. The Death's Head division had nearly bled to death itself. German casualties for the entire siege would reach approximately 55,000. Over 3,000 killed during the relief operation alone. More than 10,000 wounded. Thousands simply froze to death at their posts. Soviet losses were far greater, nearly 89,000 killed or missing. Over 156,000 wounded across the Northwest Front's relentless offensives. But the Soviets could absorb those losses. The Germans could not. While the garrison held, German commanders planned their rescue. The relief operation was codenamed Brückenschlag, meaning bridge building. Command fell to General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a man who would later gain notoriety as leader of the anti-Nazi League of German officers after his capture at Stalingrad. But in March 1942, he was the Wehrmacht's best chance of breaking through to the trapped corps. Seydlitz assembled 5 divisions, the 5th Light, the 8th Light, the 18th Motorized, and the 122nd and 329th Infantry Divisions. Supporting them were the 1st Battalion of the 203rd Panzer Regiment and the 659th and 661st Assault Gun Battalions. The plan was simple in concept, savage in execution. Strike the Soviet outer ring from the west. Simultaneously, German forces inside the pocket would attack toward them, meet in the middle, restore the land corridor. On March 21, 1942, Seydlitz's forces launched their drive. Soviet resistance along the Lovit River stalled the advance. The spring thaw was setting in. Temperatures began to climb. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, descended. The few roads in the area dissolved into bottomless quagmires. Soviet and German troops fought one another in knee-deep water and muck as the battleground forward. But Seydlitz's men kept pushing. Several breaches were torn in the Soviet line. On March 25th, a unit under Captain Max Sachsenheimer of the 5th Light Division severed a critical enemy supply route between Staraya Russa and Ramushevo. The Soviets fought back ferociously. The colonel commanding the 329th Infantry Division was killed shortly before his troops stormed Potapach and freed a trapped Totenkopf battle group that had held off the Russians for nearly 8 weeks. Caught off balance, Korochkin frantically reorganized his forces and ordered a counterattack. He opened his order of the day with the words, "Not one more step backward." The 5th Light Division was struck by multiple Red Army rifle regiments and tank battalions, but held its ground until reinforcements arrived. Ramushevo, the vital communications hub linking Staraya Russa and Demyansk, fell at heavy cost to a battalion of the 18th Motorized Division. The battalion commander, Captain Dietrich Steinhardt, was killed alongside many of his men while storming the town. Steinhardt had been a well-regarded officer, one of the few junior leaders to receive the Knight's Cross during the Polish campaign. Now he lay dead in the mud of Ramushevo. On April 14th, Operation Fallreep began. The breakout from inside the pocket, the men of Totenkopf and the remaining formations battled westward through deepening mud. On April 21st, 1942, near the village of Ramushevo, Seydlitz's forces linked up with Major General Hans Zorn's troops, fighting their way out of the pocket. A corridor, initially just 1 kilometer wide, was punched through. Over the following weeks, the Germans widened it to 6 to 8 kilometers. With the Demyansk pocket had become the Demyansk salient. The land connection was restored, but the fighting was far from over, and the real damage, the damage to German strategic thinking, was already done. The success at Demyansk etched a template into Hitler's mind. On April 22, 1942, relief had arrived. The airlift had sustained the garrison for more than 2 months. The pocket had held. The impossible had been achieved. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, trumpeted the success at every opportunity. His air force had accomplished something without precedent. They had saved an entire army corps. The Luftwaffe had vindicated its strategic worth. Göring briefed Hitler personally. He stressed the revolutionary nature of what had been achieved. Air power had conquered the ancient problem of encirclement. German armies no longer needed to fear being cut off. The Luftwaffe could sustain them indefinitely. The Luftwaffe's final ledger was striking. Over 32,000 cargo sorties, nearly 700 additional personnel flights. They delivered more than 24,000 tons of supplies and over 15,000 replacement troops. They evacuated more than 22,000 wounded. The operation consumed upward of 42,000 tons of aviation fuel, plus over 3,000 tons of lubricants. The price was steep but seemed bearable. The Luftwaffe lost 265 aircraft, including 106 Ju-52 transports, 17 Heinkel He-111 bombers, and 2 Junkers Ju-86 bombers. This represented more than half of Germany's annual transport aircraft production. More critically, 387 experienced airmen perished, men whose skills could not simply be replenished. The Soviet Air Force lost 248 aircraft, including 243 fighters. But Soviet losses could be replaced. German training infrastructure was already buckling under the strain. The British, historian Richard Overy would later call Demyansk a Pyrrhic victory. But Hitler and Göring saw only the outcome. The pocket had survived, the airlift had delivered, the precedent was set. The Ramoshevo corridor remained precarious. It was attacked repeatedly through the summer and autumn of 1942. Soviet offensives in May, July, August, and September all failed to sever it. The Germans fortified it relentlessly, 1,200 to 1,500 mines per kilometer in some sectors, a pillbox or bunker every 300 to 350 meters, but holding the salient hemorrhaged German resources. 12 divisions were immobilized in what amounted to a static bulge, unable to contribute to operations anywhere else. The Luftwaffe continued supplementing ground supply with air deliveries. The bleeding never ceased. Yet what mattered most was what crystallized inside Hitler's headquarters. The lesson drawn from Demyansk was deceptively simple. Encircled armies could be sustained from the air until relief arrived. Stand fast. The Luftwaffe would provide. That lesson would be tested once more at Stalingrad. When Hitler commanded the 6th Army to hold Stalingrad, he pointed to a single precedent: Demyansk. In November 1942, the 6th Army was encircled. Soviet forces had launched Operation Uranus on November 19th. Pincer attacks drove north and south of the city. The jaws snapped shut on November 23rd. The ring was sealed. Roughly 250,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped inside, more than double the Demyansk garrison. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus commanded the 6th Army. He immediately urged a breakout. Standard doctrine demanded it. Escape before the ring hardens. Hitler refused. On November 24th, at Führer headquarters, General Kurt Seitzler, the newly appointed Chief of Staff, laid out the facts. The 6th Army required a minimum of 750 tons of supplies per day. The General Staff had calculated that even 300 tons daily exceeded Luftwaffe capacity. What did Göring have to say? Hitler looked directly at the Reichsmarschall. It is doubtful Göring had any grasp of the Luftwaffe's actual condition in Russia. For more than a year, he had drifted between Berlin and Rome, occasionally indulging himself in Vienna, perpetually avoiding the grim realities of a war gone wrong. Göring raised his right arm. "My Führer, I personally guarantee that the Luftwaffe can keep the 6th Army supplied." Seitzler refused to yield. "The Luftwaffe absolutely cannot." Göring fired back angrily. "You are in no position to judge that." Major Gerhard Engel, Hitler's army adjutant, documented the scene in his diary. The Reichsmarschall was enormously forceful. He insisted the Luftwaffe would fly in any weather. Demyansk and other operations had proved it achievable. We were horrified by his optimism, which was not shared even by the Luftwaffe General Staff. The Führer was captivated by the Reichsmarschall, who would deliver as he always had. There was no faint-heartedness in him. Unlike what Hitler perceived in many army circles, The decision was sealed. The Sixth Army would stand. The Luftwaffe would supply them. Relief would break through, just as it had at Demyansk. Everything that had made Demyansk survivable was absent at Stalingrad. The numbers exposed the delusion. Demyansk held 95,000 troops requiring 265 tons daily. Airfields sat 200 kilometers from supply bases. Soviet air opposition was negligible. The pocket covered 3,000 square kilometers of defensible forest terrain. Stalingrad held 250,000 troops, needing 750 to 800 tons minimum. Airfields lay more than 400 kilometers from adequate bases. Soviet air forces were powerful and battle-hardened. The pocket sprawled across bombed-out urban ruins with no natural defensive advantages. Luftwaffe was spent. Its transport force had absorbed punishing losses throughout 1942, not only at Demyansk, but across North Africa and the Mediterranean. Veteran crews were gone forever. Training units had been cannibalized to fill frontline gaps. Soviet air power in late 1942 bore no resemblance to what it had been in early 1942. The Red Air Force had rebuilt from the ground up. New aircraft rolled off factory lines. Surviving pilots had honed their skills and trained replacements. Soviet fighters swarmed every approach to Stalingrad. They hunted German transports without mercy. Luftwaffe fighters attempted to screen them, but they were outnumbered and outfought. Transport losses were devastating. Aircraft fell daily. Dozens of transports destroyed in a single week. Each loss shrank airlift capacity. Each loss killed irreplaceable crews. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging in the skies above Stalingrad. The airfields inside the Stalingrad pocket were killing grounds. Potomnik and Gumrak sat under ceaseless Soviet artillery bombardment. Unlike Demyansk, where airfields enjoyed relative security, Stalingrad's landing strips were open slaughterhouses. Aircraft were wrecked on the ground. Runways were cratered. Ground crews and flight crews worked in frantic desperation. Unload the cargo, load the wounded, get airborne. Every second on the tarmac was a second under shell fire. As the pocket contracted under Soviet pressure, the airfields came under ever heavier bombardment. On January 15, 1943, Potomnik was overrun. Gumrak fell shortly after. The weather was worse. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was savage. Blizzards grounded operations for days on end. Visibility dropped to nothing. Icing brought aircraft down, but the Sixth Army still needed supplies. Every day the airlift was shut down. Conditions inside the pocket deteriorated further. Rations were slashed. Ammunition was rationed bullet by bullet. Men starved. The airlift delivered a fraction of what was required. On the best days, 100 tons reached the pocket. On the worst days, nothing arrived at all. The requirement was 750 tons daily. The 8,300 tons delivered over the entire 72-day siege would later be matched by the Berlin airlift in under 2 days on average. The relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, failed. Manstein's forces advanced to within 50 kilometers of the pocket. They could not break through. Soviet defenses were too deep. The relief force was too weak. Unlike Demyansk, where relief eventually succeeded, at Stalingrad, it did not. The Sixth Army would not be saved. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was disintegrating. Units existed only as names on paper. Regiments had shrunk to the size of companies. Companies were the size of squads. Men were too feeble to fight, too feeble to move. They crouched in rubble. They waited to die. They ate horses. They ate rats. They ate whatever their hands could find. Wounded men died because there were no medical supplies. Morphine was gone. Bandages were gone. Surgeons amputated frozen limbs without anesthesia. On February 2, 1943, the last German formations surrendered. Of 250,000 men encircled, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The catastrophe was total. The Germans estimated they lost 488 transport aircraft and 1,000 aircrew, nearly double the Demyansk losses for a fraction of the result. The training program would not recover from the blow until 1944. By the following spring, the Stalingrad airlift had cost 240 training crews and 365 training aircraft. The irony reached its bitter conclusion when Demyansk itself was finally abandoned. After Stalingrad fell, Hitler's no-retreat doctrine at last began to crack. On January 29, 1943, he authorized what he had refused for an entire year: withdrawal from the Demyansk salient. Georg von Küchler, commanding Army Group North, had pleaded for this permission for months. Recognizing that holding the bridgehead had become untenable, he had petitioned Hitler to allow a pullback. At first, Hitler refused, but on January 29th, the specter of Stalingrad changed his mind. The Germans withdrew through the Rameshevo corridor, fighting off Soviet attacks from three sides. Marshal Timoshenko launched Operation Polar Star to cut off and destroy the retreating forces. The Soviets struck the corridor from north and south, but those fortifications held, those mines, those bunkers every 300 meters. The defenses that had guarded the static salient now protected the retreat. By February 22, 1943, 2nd Army Corps had evacuated Demyansk. On March 1, 1943, Soviet troops finally entered the town. They found it deserted. The Germans had pulled out, generously mining everything in their wake. The salient that had been held for a year at such terrible cost was surrendered in weeks. The ground that had consumed 55,000 German casualties, 265 aircraft, and incalculable resources was simply given up. The entire siege had achieved nothing strategically except to immobilize German forces that could have fought elsewhere. And the precedent it created had destroyed an army at Stalingrad. The Demyansk pocket proved that the impossible was possible, and that proof would shadow every subsequent German encirclement. At Korsun-Cherkasy in early 1944, 2 German corps were encircled. Hitler ordered them to hold. An airlift was attempted. It failed. The corps had to fight their way out, suffering devastating casualties, but at least some escaped. The obliteration of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 was driven in part by Hitler's refusal to permit retreat. Multiple German armies were commanded to hold so-called fortified areas. They were surrounded and destroyed. Over 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured, a catastrophe exceeding even Stalingrad. Hitler's fortress doctrine, rooted in Demyansk's survival, made that disaster possible. Theodor Eicke survived Demyansk. He was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross on April 20, 1942, in recognition of his division's defense. He rebuilt the Totenkopf in France, received a panzer battalion, and returned to the Eastern Front in February 1943 as part of Army Group South. On February 26, 1943, just days after Demyansk's evacuation, his Fieseler Storch observation plane was shot down on final approach to a frontline unit near Kharkov. He was killed instantly. His body was buried in Ukraine, later bulldozed by Soviet forces clearing German graves. The cruelest irony of the Demyansk pocket was not that it failed. It was that it succeeded. Victory under unique circumstances taught lessons that were imposed on entirely different situations. A proof of concept became a death warrant for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who would be ordered to hold encircled positions, placing their faith in airlifts that could never replicate what Demyansk had delivered. The Luftwaffe was permanently crippled by the Demyansk legacy. Transport units were worn thin by one airlift operation after another. Aircraft were destroyed. Veteran crews were killed. Those transports were desperately needed elsewhere, training new pilots, moving supplies to Africa, supporting operations across the Mediterranean. But transport aircraft were perpetually diverted to resupply besieged pockets. The Luftwaffe's airlift capacity was squandered on hopeless missions, missions that failed, missions that were doomed before they launched. But Demyansk had proven that airlift could work. So the missions continued. The transports were destroyed. The Luftwaffe's logistical backbone was broken for the remainder of the war. The psychological toll on German leadership was profound. Demyansk bred false confidence. It implied that modern technology had overturned fundamental military realities, that air power could transcend ancient constraints, that encirclement was no longer a death sentence.